Hi, I'm Kathy Williams with Ashling Truck Academy. Today we're going to perform an Oregon pre-trip inspection using Dexter here. We're going to carry around our Oregon pre-trip inspection memory aid. This is the aid the state allows us to carry with us when we're actually performing the state test. So, to begin, first thing I need to do is make sure that the tractor parking brake is set and that I've removed my keys. I'm going to be starting with the engine compartment. Now, as I go through this inspection process, I need to make sure that I'm thoroughly explaining condition, securement, and leaks on all applicable components. I'm also going to point to or touch each item that I'm inspecting. Okay, I'm going to start over here with my fluid levels. This is my oil dipstick. I'm checking the fluid to make sure it's not too high or too low. I'm going to check my coolant. I'm going to check to make sure it's not too high or too low. And I'm also not going to remove the cap if it's hot. Checking my power steering fluid level, I want to make sure it's not too high or too low. Next, I'm going to check my belts. Checking the condition, I want to make sure they're not cracked, worn, or frayed, and that they don't deflect more than 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to check my air compressor. My air compressor is located right here. I'm going to make sure that there are no loose or missing bolts and there's no leaks of air or fluid. I'm checking my alternator next. My alternator is securely attached. There's no loose or missing bolts. The wires are securely attached. There's no broken, burnt, loose, or exposed wires. I'm checking for fluid leaks underneath the engine compartment. Checking for puddles down here, but I'm also checking to make sure I don't see any fluids running down the side of the engine. I'm checking all of my hoses to make sure there's no cuts, no holes, and no leaks in any of the hoses, and that they're all securely fastened with the clamps. Next, I'm going to be checking over here my steering box. My steering box right here is securely attached. There's no loose or missing bolts. It's not cracked and it's not leaking. I'm checking the hoses that are going from the power steering reservoir to the steering box. I want to make sure that there's no cuts, no holes, no leaks, and that they're securely attached. I'm checking the steering linkage next. This is my pitman arm. I want to make sure it's not cracked, bent, or broken. It's securely attached. There's no loose or missing bolts. There's a castle nut and a cotter pin down here that I need to make sure are securely in place. My drag link down here is not cracked, bent, or broken. The castle nut and the cotter pin are securely in place on it. And I'm also going to check my steering linkage up here that goes from my steering wheel down to the steering box. I want to make sure it's not cracked, bent, or broken, and that the joints in the sockets are not excessively worn. Next, I'm going to be checking my suspension. This tractor is equipped in the front area with springs. I'm checking the springs to make sure they're not cracked or broken, none are missing, and none have shifted in danger of hitting the tire. I'm checking the spring mounts. The springs are mounted in 3 places. The actual spring mounts in the front and the rear, and then the U-bolts in the center. The U-bolts are not cracked or broken. There's no loose or missing bolts. The spring mounts in the front and the rear are not cracked or broken. There's no loose or missing bolts, and there's no worn bushings. Next, I'm going to be checking my shock absorber. I want to make sure it's securely attached. There's no loose or missing bolts. There's no missing parts, and it's not leaking. That concludes the engine compartment. I'm going to close and latch the hood. Clear? Next, I'm going to check the driver door area. I'm going to check my mirrors and mirror brackets first to make sure that there's no broken, loose, or missing parts, no missing hardware, and no loose or missing bolts. attaches properly. I'm checking the fuel area next. I need to make sure that my cap is on tight. I'm checking the straps or the bands to make sure that none have shifted and that the hardware is all there securely in place and there's no loose or missing bolts or loose or missing hardware. I'm also going to be checking underneath to make sure that I have no fuel leaks. Coming to the rear of the tractor, I'm going to be checking my drive shaft. It's located underneath the catwalk here. I'm checking my drive shaft to make sure it's not dented or twisted. The U-joints are securely in place. They're lubricated. There's no loose or missing bolts or missing U-joints. The carrier bearing up at the front of my drive shaft is not excessively worn, and there's no loose or missing bolts. It's securely in place. Next, I'm checking my exhaust system. Checking to make sure it's securely attached. There's no loose or missing bolts. I'm looking for cracks or holes in the exhaust system itself, or loose or missing clamps, or any soot trails that might indicate that I have an exhaust leak. Next, I'm going to check my frame rails. I want to make sure my frame is not cracked or broken. There's no broken welds or aftermarket welds. I'm checking my air connectors to make sure that they're securely locked in place. I'm checking the air lines to make sure there's no cuts, no holes, no wear marks, and no leaks. I want to make sure they're securely attached to the tractor as well as the trailer. My electrical line is plugged in correctly and securely with the lock on the cap. Checking the electrical line itself to make sure there's no cuts, no abrasions, no wear marks, or exposed wires. I want to make sure it's also connected securely to the tractor and that my air and my electrical lines are not hanging too low where they're going to get tangled up or rubbing on the catwalk and develop holes. Next, I'm going to check my catwalk to make sure it's securely attached. There's no loose or missing bolts. There's no cracks, bends, or breaks in my catwalk. I'm checking my header board. Now, this trailer really doesn't have a header board, but it does have the front of the trailer that protects us from the cargo. I want to make sure I see no bulges or cracks in the front of my trailer, and also no loose or missing rivets or loose or missing bolts. Now we're going to move on to the coupling system. I have a fifth wheel coupling system on this tractor and trailer. I'm going to use my laser light to point out the parts here so it's easier for you to see. These are my mounting bolts. I want to make sure that I have no cracked, broken, loose, or missing mounting bolts. This is my platform right here. I want to make sure my platform is not cracked, broken, or damaged in any way. My fifth wheel skid plate is right here. It's connected to my platform with this pin and cotter pin. I want to make sure it's correctly secured. I also want to make sure that my fifth wheel skid plate is properly lubricated. This is my release arm. My release arm is locked in place and secure. It's not bent, cracked, or broken. Next, I'm going to be checking the kingpin. Kingpin is in here, and it's not bent, cracked, or broken, or missing, and the locking jaws are securely locked around the kingpin. It's difficult to see when you're coupled to a trailer or tractor unless you get underneath and actually look in here. The apron right here is not bent or cracked, and there is no space between the apron and the fifth wheel. The sliding fifth wheel locking pins are located right here. We want to make sure that those are securely locked in place. And we're also checking for air leaks on this air line here that's operated by the switch that's on the dash in the cab. I'm going to come back here. I'm checking my landing gear. I want to make sure that my landing gear is all the way up in the fully raised position. I'm checking the frame to make sure that there's no bends or cracks or breaks any place in the landing gear structure, and there's no loose or missing bolts. I also want to make sure that my handle is secure. Next, I'm checking the trailer frame. Checking to make sure it's not cracked or bent or damaged. I'm checking underneath here my cross members to make sure that they're not cracked, bent, or broken. There's no loose or missing bolts or rivets. I'm also checking the subfloor to make sure I have no holes in the subfloor where the freight might fall through or somebody could get hurt. Coming back here, the tandem release is locked in place. The bar itself is not cracked or broken or damaged in any way. There's no loose or missing bolts. I want to make sure that my slider pins are securely locked in place. I have 2 on either side. I want to make sure the structure is not bent, cracked, or broken. There's no broken welds. There's no loose or missing bolts. I'm going to come back here to my trailer rims. I'm going to check the flange first to make sure it's not bent or cracked. Checking the rim itself to make sure that there's no cracks, no aftermarket welds, no excessive rust, and no out-of-round bolt holes. I'm going to be checking my tire to make sure that the sidewall has no abrasions or cuts, it's not bulging. Checking the tread depth on my tires. All tires except for my steer tires must have a minimum of 2/32 of an inch of tread depth. The steer tires must have a minimum of 4/32 of an inch of tread depth. I would check for proper inflation with an inflation gauge, and I would also check my valve stem down here to make sure it's not bent, cracked, or broken. The cap is securely in place and it's not leaking air. I'm going to be checking in between my duals to make sure that I have no foreign objects and that my duals are not rubbing. Checking my lug nuts to make sure that they're all there and in place. There's no loose or missing lug nuts. The wheel studs themselves are not cracked or broken or missing, and there's no rust trails that might indicate a loose lug nut. My hub and my axle seal, I want to make sure that my fluid is at the proper level. Checking the sight glass itself to make sure it's not cracked or broken. The plug is securely in place, and I'm looking for any leaks here inside the wheel and also on the inside of the dual for any leaking wheel seals. Next I'm going to be coming back here. I'm checking my slack adjusters and push rods. I'm going to get my laser light out again so we can see. Slack adjusters are right here. The push rod is right there. Checking to make sure when the brakes are set that I have no less than a 90-degree angle between the slack adjuster and the push rod. When the brakes are released, which they are right now on this trailer, that I have no more than 1 inch of travel when I pull back on this adjuster arm. I'm checking the slack adjuster itself to make sure that there's no loose or missing bolts, no broken, loose, or missing parts, and that this push rod is not bent. Next thing I'm going to check is my chambers. I'm going to come up here, they're easier to see. My brake chambers are not dented or cracked in any way. They're securely attached, there's no loose or missing bolts, and they're not leaking. The hoses here that are attached to my chambers are securely attached. There's no cuts, no holes, and no leaks. The trailer lines back here are where the air lines run the length of the trailer. I want to check these lines to make sure that there's no cuts, no holes, no leaks, and that they're properly suspended so they're not going to drag the ground. Next I'm going to be checking my drums and linings. My brake drums right here are not cracked, warped, or worn. My brake linings down here are not cracked or broken, and they're at least at least a 1/4 of an inch thick. They're not contaminated with grease or oil. I'm checking my trailer suspension next. My airbags. This particular trailer is equipped with airbag suspension. My airbags are fully inflated. They're not leaking. There's no cuts, holes, or abrasions. And they're securely mounted to their mounts. The mounts are not cracked or broken. There's no loose or missing bolts or broken welds on the airbag mounts themselves. Now this trailer, because of the airbag suspension, does not have a torque arm or radius rod. What it does have is a rocker arm suspension. I would inspect it to make sure it's not cracked or broken. There's no broken welds, there's no loose or missing bolts, and there's no worn bushings. Next I'm going to check my rear doors. Checking my trailer doors, both top and bottom, to make sure that they're securely latched and locked. checking the hinges to make sure that the hinges themselves are not cracked or broken. There's no loose or missing pins and no loose or missing bolts. Checking my mud flaps to make sure my mud flaps are not ripped or torn, there's no holes, and they're no more than 10 inches off the ground. That's an Oregon rule. Different states have different guidelines for that. There's also no loose or missing bolts, so the mud flap isn't going to fall off the truck or trailer. Okay, now it's time to do our lights and reflectors. I'm going to ask the examiner to help me check all the lights and reflectors. We want to make sure that they're clean, they're not cracked or broken, and they're functioning properly. We're going to start with the front of the truck. I'm going to get in, I'm going to turn the key on, but I'm not going to start the truck. And I'm going to ask the examiner to help me check out in front first. I'm going to go ahead and go through the lights. It's my left turn signal, right turn signal, four-way flashers, headlights, and high beams. Can you check my clearance lights as well on the top of my cab? And can I have you help me check the lights in the rear? On the way back, I'd like you to help me check my clearance lights and my reflective tape. Clearance lights should be amber in the front and red to the rear. Tail light, left turn signal, right turn signal, four-way flasher, brake light, clearance light. Please join me in the cab.
No.
Okay, the first thing I'm going to check in here is I'm going to check my seat belt. I want to make sure it's not ripped, torn, or frayed. It's securely mounted to the truck and it latches properly. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start my engine, but before I do, I'm going to point out my oil pressure gauge. I want to make sure when I start the engine that the oil pressure rises within 3 to 5 seconds. If it doesn't, I'm going to shut the engine off to avoid engine damage. This truck, I turn the key on. The gauges are going to cycle.
You have 90.
Once they come back, I'm going to count to 8.
Unread messages.
It's our Qualcomm lady talking there. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make sure my truck is in neutral. I'm going to push the clutch all the way to the floor. And I'm going to start the engine. It's going to cycle one more time, and then the oil pressure should come up. 3, 4. The oil pressure came up. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be checking the lighting indicators in cab. I'm going to check my left turn signal, my right turn signal, my four-way flashers, and my high beam indicator to make sure that they're all working. Okay, now I'm going to check my gauges. Again, this is my oil pressure gauge. I made sure that my oil pressure came up within the first 3 to 5 seconds. If it hadn't, I would have shut the engine off to avoid damage. This is my voltmeter. I want to make sure that it's showing around 14 volts to show a charge. This is my primary and my secondary air gauges. I want to make sure that my air pressure is rising all the way up to around 125 pounds of pressure. Next, I'm going to be checking my mirrors. I'm going to check my mirrors to make sure they're clean, they're not cracked or chipped, and they're properly adjusted for me. My windshield is clean, it's not cracked or chipped, there's nothing obstructing my view. I'm checking my windshield wipers and washers to make sure that my washers work properly, my wipers work properly, and that my blades are not ripped, torn, or missing, or loose. Next, I'm going to be checking my my horns. I have my city horn and my air horn. I'm going to be checking my heater and my defroster. So I'm going to turn this all the way to defrost. heat. Checking to make sure that I have air coming out of the vents, which I do. I'm going to turn this back to heat. Give it a second to change the cycle. There it goes. Make sure that I have air coming out of my heater vents. I'm going to turn this back to AC because it's warm today. Okay, next I'm going to talk about my safety and emergency equipment. This truck is equipped with, in the side box, a fully charged and properly rated fire extinguisher. There are 3 orange reflective triangles, and my fuse box is right here. I carry spare fuses down here. Now we're going to start our air brakes checks. Now the next 3 tests that I'm going to perform are my leaks, my low air, and my tractor protection valve tests. I have to get all 3 of these tests 100% correct. If I do not, it's grounds for immediate failure of my state test. So the first thing that I need to do is I need to make sure that I have both of my brakes released, my tractor and my trailer. And then I need to make sure that the truck is stable, that I'm not going to roll. If I were to roll, I would go ahead and I would reset these brakes and I would put wheel chocks in to keep the vehicle from rolling. So we're stable right here. First thing I'm going to do is my leaks test. I'm going to use my primary gauge only, and I'm going to fan the brakes down until I reach 90 pounds of pressure, which is going to be between this mark here and this mark here. I'm going to hold over 50 pounds of pressure on my application gauge right here for 1 minute. What I'm looking for is I'm looking for the pressure to either remain steady or begin to rise. If it continues to fall, that means I have a leak in my system someplace that I have to get fixed before I can use the truck. So watching my primary, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to fan the brakes down. And that's about 90 right there. Holding over 50 pounds of application pressure. And I'm holding that steady because if I let pressure off and then reapply more pressure, it's going to make the air pressure go down and it'll look like I have a leak when I don't. Every 15 seconds, I'm going to give the examiner an update of what's happening with the air pressure. So it's been 15 seconds and my air pressure is definitely rising. It's been 30 seconds, my air pressure is still rising. It's been 45 seconds, my air pressure is still rising. And I'm still well over 50 pounds of pressure on the application gauge. It's 1 minute and my air pressure rose, indicating no leak in the system. I'm going to continue to fan the brakes down now until my low air warning devices come on. In this truck, it's a light on the dash as well as a buzzer, and it'll sound probably around 60 psi, but must sound no lower than 55 psi. So it actually came on at about between 65 and 70 psi. The last test I'm going to perform is my tractor protection valve test. I'm going to continue to fan the brakes down until my tractor protection valve pops out. It'll pop out no lower than 20 psi. I can feel the brakes start to get spongy, meaning that they're fading and they're not as effective. And it popped out at about 23 psi. Next test I'm going to perform is the parking brake test. But first I have to raise my air pressure back up to at least 100 pounds of pressure. Okay, so we've brought the pressure up over 100 pounds, and now I've gone ahead and released the trailer brake. It's going to take a lot of air to go ahead and reinflate those airbags back there and recharge the system. So I want to make sure that my pressure gauge stabilizes before I start the parking brake test, which is our next test, because the trailer brakes won't release until everything is charged back there. So I could go ahead and do a parking brake test right now, and it might be the trailer brakes holding me back. So it's important to wait until everything stabilizes and you're no longer losing air to the trailer. Okay. So my air pressure gauge is stabilized. It's up over 100 pounds. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to put the truck in second gear. And I'm going to tug gently forward to make sure that my parking brake is holding. Okay, that's working just fine. Now I'm going to release my tractor parking brake and I'm going to check the service brake. I'm going to pull forward. I'm still in second gear. I'm going to pull forward and I'm going to apply the service brake. And I'm going to be holding the steering wheel lightly, checking to make sure that the steering wheel doesn't pull to one side or another and that the brakes properly stop the tractor and trailer. Okay, and we stop and it didn't pull one side or the other. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to back the truck back in, putting my four-way flashers on, looking in both mirrors, and tapping the horn. Alright, so that concludes the Oregon pre-trip inspection. I hope you learned something today. I wish you good luck on your Oregon State test. And don't hesitate to contact Ashling Truck Academy if you need any help in your studies.